have delayed the operation into winter. To compound the problems of the battles for the attackers, Panzer Group 4 was withdrawn from Army Group North in late September 1941 in order to support Army Group Center in Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow. No German Army Group could afford to lose its tanks, but Army Group North lost virtually all of its armour. The withdrawal of the tanks from Army Group North meant that the army was virtually immobile. It was to remain so for almost 3 years. It is easy to suggest that the loss of Panzer Group 4 in September 1941 was directly responsible for the failure of Army Group North to take its strategic objective of Leningrad. However, this is by no means certain. The capture of a city as large and well defended as Leningrad was by no means certain, even with a strong armoured force. Nevertheless, the removal of Panzer Group 4 clearly did not help the cause of Army Group North. It meant that Army Group North would be denied this one formation and the size, speed and fighting power to advance quickly into the regions beyond the city of Leningrad, link up with the Finns and effectively cut off the city from its supplies. The disappearance of Panzer Group 4 proved to be a forerunner of things to come. From that point onwards, the evidence was clear that of the 3 German army groups, Army Group North was considered to be the poor relation. It soon became obvious that they could expect to receive no substantial additional support of any kind, and the artillery siege train would never be sent to Leningrad. The 18th Army therefore had no alternative but to take Leningrad by siege. It seemed that the decisive battles on the Eastern Front would be fought elsewhere. With the commencement of the siege of Leningrad, a relatively stable front line appeared in the northern sector. The 16th Army fought on the right flank of the northern sector, where it was adjacent to the left wing of Army Group Center. The 18th Army fought on the left flank of the 16th Army, and as such formed the extreme northern end of the front line. Army Group North was to remain doggedly committed to the northern flank of the German armies fighting on the Eastern Front for the entire duration of the war. The siege of Leningrad was the stage for an intense struggle that would in later years be recognized as a key event in that conflict of inhuman savagery. The opening stages were bitterly fought in the suburbs of the city. When General Zhukov arrived to take over the defence of the city on the 10th of September 1941, he found the defenders in an advanced state of disorganisation and the inhabitants close to panic. Undaunted, he briskly set about bolstering its defences. A shortage of anti-tank guns was dealt with by converting anti-aircraft artillery to the task of attempting to halt the panzers. 6 brigades of naval infantry and students were formed, and reinforcements drafted in from the Karelian Isthmus. Zhukov began to take the fight to the Germans through raids and counterattacks. But by now, the German troops had pierced the inner circle of defences and were rampaging through the suburbs. After a furious exchange of advances and retreats, by the end of the month, the defenders were hanging onto their city by their fingernails. It seemed inevitable that Leningrad would capitulate. But as Zhukov awaited a renewed assault, the 4th Panzer Group suddenly departed to join the battle for Moscow, and the remaining German forces began to build defences. Hitler had decreed that Leningrad would not be taken by force. It would instead be starved into submission. But there was a flaw in the plan. Although the supply situation was difficult without Panzer Group 4, the ring around the city was never completely closed. It was still possible to reach the city over land, through the virgin forests of the Russian motherland. It was also possible to bring in supplies by boat across the waters of Lake Ladoga. In October, there was some temporary relief for the defenders. The roads had disintegrated into canals of bottomless mud, along which wheeled vehicles could drive only at a snail's pace, and only if they were towed by tanks. This was the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, which came as a debilitating surprise to the Germans in 1941. General Rauss went to great lengths after the war to explain the great significance of the muddy season. German losses of tanks and motorized equipment of all types were extraordinarily high during the autumn muddy period of 1941, the first time that the mud of Russia was encountered. A division of the 4th Panzer Group, operating in the area north of Gzhatsk during the same period, lost 50 tanks without a shot being fired, 35 of them within 3 days. These losses were extremely serious, since no replacements were received. The Germans had no conception of mud as it exists in European Russia. In the autumn of 1941, when frontline troops were already stuck fast, the German High Command still believed that mud could be conquered by brute force, an idea that led to serious losses of vehicles and equipment. At the height of the muddy season, tractors and recovery vehicles, normally capable of traversing difficult terrain, are helpless, and attempts to plough through the muddy mass makes roads even more impassable. Tanks, heavy recovery vehicles, and even vehicles with good ground clearance simply pushed an ever-growing wall of mud before them until they finally stopped, half buried by their own motion. A sudden frost in the autumn of 1941 cemented a crippled, buried column into a state of complete uselessness, and it never moved again. Because it could not be reached in any other way, gasoline, tow ropes and food supplies were airdropped along the line of stranded armour, but all attempts to move were futile. Often, when drivers found themselves bogged down, far from any habitation, they abandoned their vehicles and set out on foot to contact friendly troops in the nearest village, or sought food and shelter from local civilians in order to remain alive until the worst of the muddy season passed. For the muddy seasons, vehicles with high ground clearance, light weight and low unit ground pressure were necessary. German trucks had low ground clearance and could not get